Rojbash, Sabah al-Khair. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. I will speak in English because my Kurdish and my Arabic is still lousy. But to make it a bit easier for the translation, I did something I normally don't do, that I prepare a written presentation. So I will mainly read from what I prepared for today. The division of Kurdistan by the Treaty of Lausanne also reinforced the political division of the entire region. Despite all Kurdish claims by Kurdish nationalist parties and movements, the Kurdish political parties that have emerged since the mid-20th century have developed differently in the four parts of Kurdistan. This is also a result, but not only a result, of the political division following the Lausanne Treaty and the differences in the self-conception of all these four states. We know that the division of Kurdistan into an Iranian and Ottoman zone of influence is much older. But since the Treaty of Lausanne, we have had to deal with three more different states in addition to Iran, namely Turkey, Syria, and Iraq, which now no longer saw themselves as a multi-ethnic empire, as the Ottoman Empire did, but as nation states. And despite commonalities of these states, these nation states also had strong differences in their political structures and their self-conceptions as nations. Turkey probably had the most precarious national identity among these four states, as the remnant of the multi-ethnic and multi-religious Ottoman Empire. Mustafa Kemal initially attempted to mobilize the Kurds for Turkey by means of reminiscences of the common Ottoman Caliphate, and thus to secure not only today's Turkey, but also the former Vilayat Mosul for Turkey. However, after its victory in the War of Independence, as Turkey calls this war, and the signing of the Treaty of Lausanne, the Turkish government saw any cultural diversity as a threat to the new nation state that has to be created. After all, it was only a minority of the new citizens who actually spoke Turkish and saw themselves as Turkish. Turkish was still regarded in the late Ottoman Empire as synonymous for a poor rural population, in particular the nomadic Yörüks. No urban Ottoman citizen would have understood himself as Turkish, and the remaining population spoke languages from all over the Ottoman Empire. Many were descendants of Muslims who came from the North Caucasus before the Russian invasion, or from the Slavic and Albanian-speaking eras on the Balkans, in the wake of the loss of southeastern Europe. Others were descendants of Crimean Tatars, or spoke Greek or Armenian, but had converted to Islam. In the population exchange with Greece, 1923 as well, religion and not language was ultimately the decisive criterion for who has to go to Greece and who can stay. Small remnants of Pontus Greek population who converted to Islam can still be found on the Black Sea, and even though the Hemshin were never considered Armenians by Turkish nationalists, which probably saved their lives, they still speak an Armenian dialect in present-day Turkey. The largest linguistic minorities, however, were the Zaza and Kurmanji-speaking Kurdish populations in southeastern Turkey. To make a Turkish nation state out of these diverse population required, from the Turkish government's point of view, an authoritarian enforcement of linguistic and cultural unification. From the experiences of the collapsing Ottoman Empire, it was finally concluded that any cultural diversity would carry the core of separatism and thus be suppressed. Turkey was actually oriented on the French civic nation model and not on the German ethnic descendant model. But this model also required assimilation. One could become a Turk as an Albanian, Slav, Circassian, or even as a Kurd by adopting the Turkish language and the commitment to the Turkish state. We also know that Ziya Gökalp, one of the most aggressive Turkish nationalists, was actually a Kurd. However, those who refused to assimilate were considered and treated as traitors. Turkey thus became the only one of the four states in which even the existence of the Kurdish identity and language was denied, and the language was ultimately banned until this complete ban was lifted in 1992. Syria and Iraq, unlike Turkey, have never denied the existence of the Kurds or the Kurdish language. Nevertheless, after the end of the British and French protectorate rule, the policies of both states were long dominated by Arab nationalism and, since the 1960s, by the Arab nationalist Ba'ath Party. Ba'athism's concept of nation was more closely aligned with the fascist models in Germany and Italy and did not follow the French nation model, but rather the ethnic German model. It is true that Ba'athism, with its emphasis on the nation-building role of Islam as a cultural rather than a religious concept, also had the possibility of joining the Arab nation. Fundamentally, however, this was seen more as a community of descendants and less as a nation of citizens. Smaller communities, such as some Christian minorities, were integrated into the Arab nation, despite the fact that many of them had Arabic or had not Arabic as their mother tongue, actually, and spoke Aramaic. In this model, however, the Kurds are definitely a different people, perhaps inferior from the perspective of Arab nationalism, dangerous and to be suppressed, but their existence was not denied. While the Kurds of Iraq still had a chance for autonomy under the British system of indirect rule, which they partly lost by their own tribal and regional differences, the Syrian Kurds, with their settlement area geographically fragmented into three parts, were always in a weaker position. In both states, Arab nationalists saw themselves threatened by Kurdish autonomist movements, even if they took on a very different character in each case. In the largely closed Kurdish settlement areas of Iraqi Kurdistan, armed uprising occurred again and again, even under British rule, but they always remained regional and tribal, turning at least as much against the implementation of a central state as for the establishment of an independent Kurdish state. In Syria, only civil movements and underground parties existed, and Syria often became a country of exile for insurgents from Turkish and Iraqi parts of Kurdistan. This did not change the fact that Syria also suppressed its own Kurdish population, not by denying their existence, as in Turkey, but by claiming that the Syrian Kurds were all refugees from Turkey and not an original population of Syria at all. The special census in the Jazira of November 1962 in which some 120,000 Syrian Kurds lost their citizenship and whose descendants were not able to regain the Syrian nationality until 2011, was the result of this narrative. The Arab Belt of 1965 was also an attempt to separate the Syrian Kurds from the Kurds in Bakur and Bashur. As we all know, the history of the Kurds in Iraq was much bloodier than in Syria, with the various, somehow often rival insurgencies and the height of the state repression in the 1980s, when the Iraqi regime Anfal campaign and the poison gas attacks on Halabja and the other Kurdish towns left over 100,000 civilians dead. However, despite the genocidal insurgents, the genocidal anti-insurgents policy in the context of the Iraq-Iran war, in which the Kurdish Peshmerga were branded as traitors, Iraq, unlike Turkey, never denied the existence of the Kurds. On the contrary, even Saddam Hussein saw the Kurds as part of the Iraqi population, had himself photographed in traditional Kurdish clothing, and deliberately tried to exploit tribal conflicts within the Kurdish population, for example, to draw traditional rivals of the Barzanis to his own side. Finally, we should not forget that many Kurds fought in the regime-loyal Fursan Salahuddin, the units that were called by the Kurds Jash, the traitors, the collaborators with the Iraqi regime, then there were ever Peshmergas fighting against the regime. But let us leave these well-known historical details aside. What is decisive here are two things. Even in the times of the harshest repression, the Kurdish language and identity were not denied in Iraq, unlike in Turkey. In the 1970 autonomy agreement between Mustafa Barzani and Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi state explicitly recognized Kurdish as Iraq's second official and educational language, and despite the failure of the agreement, Kurdish actually became the official language of Iraqi Kurdistan through the regime's unilateral actions involving some splinter groups of the PDK, including some prominent figures like Mullah Mustafa's oldest son, Ubaidullah Barzani. Unlike Turkey, Iraq did not attempt to assimilate the Kurds, but rather to integrate them into its own system of rule and power, and to use existing intra-Kurdish lines of conflict to maintain its own power. On the one hand, Iraq was the part of Kurdistan where the Kurds were subjected to the worst persecution, but on the other hand, they had more linguistic and cultural rights than in any other part of Kurdistan. Oppression in Iraq was mainly a political oppression and less a cultural and linguistic assimilation. Even in the Iranian part of Kurdistan, or in Rojava, as Kurds say, Eastern Kurdistan, the existence of the Kurdish people and the Kurdish language was never denied. Iran never saw itself as a nation state, and although Persian nationalists played an important role throughout the 20th century, both the monarchy of the Pahlavi dynasty and the Islamic Republic after 1979 did not see themselves and consider themselves as a nation state, but rather as empires. The Pahlavi dynasty saw itself with a historicizing, watching backwards as a successor of the Achaemenid Empire, while the Islamic Republic saw itself as a political center of the Shiite world. The territory of the former Kurdish Emirate of Ardalan, for example, is still called Kurdistan province in Iran. Iran does not have a fundamental problem with the Kurdish language, which is considered as one of Iran's many minority languages. Kurdish books and newspapers can be published. However, Kurdish publications, like all publications in Iran, are subjected to censorship. The publication of a book often requires months for getting the permission, and the Kurdish language has no official status. It's not used in any state institution or in the educational system. Kurdish can be taught only privately, in privately organized courses, and even those are often harassed. The most prominent case maybe in this, concerning this harassment by the Iranian authorities, is the arrest of the teacher Sara Mohammadi in 2022. So we see that actually very different state and nation concepts emerged in the post-Lausanne order in the Middle East, and those had different consequences for the different parts of Kurdistan, and it also had different consequences for the political movements that emerged in these different parts of Kurdistan. So, while the indirect rule that existed in Iraq during the British Empire encouraged, for example, the continuation of a tribal and feudal system, the more republican systems in Turkey partly crashed these feudal structures and tribal structures. That does not mean that tribes do not play a role in other parts of Kurdistan as well, but they play a very different role to a different extent in different parts of Kurdistan. So the Kurdish societies itself in these four countries were shaped by the different concepts of the different nation states, actually. And we should also not forget that social questions like the question of the land reform that happened in Iraq, for example, started in Iraq during the regime of Abdul Karim Qasim after 1958, played an important role for the Kurdish political movements and the internal fragmentation, because one of the important questions of internal Kurdish divisions was always, is the national question more important or the social question? So should we ally ourselves with the Aras against the states, or should we first make a social revolution within the Kurdish society? It would go far beyond the focus of this speech to go into details about these political conflicts. But a result of the developments, of these developments, was that the Kurdish society in Iraq stayed much more tribal than in Turkey and in Syria, and that not only the tribes but also Sufi tarikats played a much stronger also political role, the Naqshbandis and the Qadiris, because at the end of the day both important political parties were ruled by families who were leading figures in these Sufi tarikats, the Barzanis from the Naqshbandi and the Talabanis from the Qadiri order. A result of the different political arenas in these four nation states was also that in these four nation states, in the Kurdish parts of these four nation states, different Kurdish political movements became dominant. While some of these parties, like PKK and PDK, have relevant, more or less sister parties or friendly movements in other parts of Kurdistan, it is very clear that the political landscape in all four parts of Kurdistan is very different today, and that the Kurdish parties are to a certain degree also shaped by the political systems of the states they are organized in. In the more tribally organized Iraqi part of Kurdistan, tribal structures also play a more important role within the Kurdish political parties, especially the two leading political parties, PUK and PDK. In Turkey and Syria, with its more republican structures, parties like PKK or PYD, based on ideology and a more centralized party structure, could gain more influence. However, where the groups close to PKK could gain influence in Iraq, namely in the Yazidi-dominated Shingal region, they also had to deal with the more tribal structures as well. In the last years, the Sinjar resistance units, YBS, also got involved into tribal politics of the Shingal region, and were, for example, involved in sulh processes like they existed in different parts of Iraq for decades. The division of Kurdistan also enabled the newly formed states to use Kurdish political movements in the neighboring states for their own regional interests. If there is one constant in the changing field of Kurdish politics, it's the fact that Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey supported Kurdish parties and guerrilla movements in their neighboring countries and oppressed their own Kurdish political movements. Iran used Iraqi Kurdish movements against Iraq. Iraq used Iranian Kurdish movements against Iran. Syria supported the PKK against Turkey, and until today, one of the reasons for the internal conflict between the major parties in Iraqi Kurdistan is that PUK cooperates with Iran and PDK cooperates with Turkey. All Kurdish actors were too weak to fight without outside support, which repeatedly made them dependent on their supporters. This, in turn, increased political tensions between Kurdish political actors and enabled the ruling forces to continue their rule based on the principle divide et impera. In the last 100 years, since the Treaty of Lausanne, the different parts of Kurdistan did interact with each other, but they also became parts of the different political arenas of their new nation states. And even the parties that were fundamentally opposing these political systems were to a certain degree shaped by these political systems. Not only the different dialects of Kurdish are shaped by the loan words of Arabic, Turkish, or Persian, and they use different alphabets, but also the political structures today in the four parts of Kurdistan are very different. This added up to the already existent fragmentations within Kurdish societies, the tribal religious fragmentations. Since 1991, Kurdish para-states or de facto autonomous regions started to appear again. In Iraq since 1991, in Syria since 2012. So it took nearly 90 years after the Lausanne Treaty until there was a border controlled by Kurds on both sides and a border post where all the foreigners who came to this conference went through, Feshhapur on the Iraqi and Zemalka on the Syrian side. However, it's very it's very interesting that this Kurdish border is one of the most difficult borders to cross, and it's very difficult and needs a lot of permissions to cross. So the divisions within the Kurds 100 years after Lausanne are not just divisions opposed by the ruling powers in the region, there are also internalized divisions within the Kurdish population of the Middle East. And this unity and the dependence of Kurdish political movements, the dependence of Kurdish economy from outsiders, and from outsiders who are mostly hostile to the Kurds, is one of the biggest challenges for the Kurds 100 years after Lausanne. And I think it's not my job as a Western intellectual to discuss mainly the alternatives towards this order and towards the nation state in the Middle East. It's more something the peoples, not only the Kurds, the peoples in the region have to discuss. But I think it's important to see this bigger picture of the problems that occurred after the Lausanne Treaty, with the increased divisions within the Kurdish population by dependence and disunity that was created by the nation states that were emerging here through the system that started after World War I, and where Lausanne was at least an important part of it. Thank you very much.